Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Since charts are fair game, I will just briefly begin with one of my own. Mr. Secretary, this is a very short inventory of President Trump's insults towards our allies and partners. I know you can't read it. I can't even read it. The typeface has to be so small because we couldn't even include all of the deleterious things that the president has said about our historic allies over the course of the last year and a half. I think this treatment concerns both Democrats and Republicans, not because we don't think that our allies sometimes should be subject to criticism, but because we think that the pace and the vitriol of this criticism is harming in real time U.S. national security interests. The latest was a tweet that seemed to cheer on the political opponents and political opposition to the German chancellor, especially in Europe. This difficult and hard treatment of our allies in very personal tones. It elevates the right and the nationalists, the very people who are trying to destroy NATO and the EU. And so I guess it wasn't surprising to many of us that the Germans in particular have been so far a very hard case in the effort of this administration to try to reapply sanctions against Iran. They are not looking to us to reapply a sanctions regime. They're doing the opposite. They passed legislation that gives their companies attempted safe harbor or hold harmless harbor from U.S. secondary sanctions. It's hard to imagine how we will put together a sanctions regime against Iran that, in your words, will be the strongest ever if we are creating this space between the United States and our allies in Europe. We should all remember that the U.S. does $300 million in trade historically with Iran. Germany does $2.5 billion. China does $23 billion. Maybe I'm just asking for an update on discussions with the Europeans and our partners with respect to progress being made or not being made to reapply sanctions. That's the foundation of the administration's plan, and it seems that this particularly rough treatment of our European allies is pushing us further away from that new sanctions regime against Iran rather than closer to it.
Senator Murphy, it is the case. They've been difficult discussions since the U.S. decision to withdraw. There's no doubt about that. The Europeans had consistently talked about a different view, a different path forward. The plan that they'd preferred, we chose differently. But I will say over the last handful of weeks, there's an increasing recognition that we need to find a way forward together. And so when I talked about building the toughest sanctions in history, I am still intent and optimistic that I can do it. Remember, it's not just about 3 European countries. There are many European countries that are prepared to assist us in this. There's countries throughout Asia. We have our Gulf state partners as well. This is a broad coalition. Sometimes the focus just ends up being on France and Britain and Germany, not to underestimate their importance. They're critical partners. I want them alongside of us for sure. But to get a global sanctions regime requires an effort all around the world. We have teams that have fanned out across the world in the weeks after our announcement of the withdrawal to begin to work on shaping what that would look like. My recollection is that when the previous administration talked about their ability to build this out, they talked about it in terms of years. I'm hoping to beat that substantially.
I wanted to return to an answer you gave to Senator Lankford. He asked you if there was a way forward in Syria with Iran present, and your answer was pretty definitive. It was no. Mm-hmm. Iran was present in Syria, had influence there well before the civil war started. I think most everyone that's watched that country over time doesn't foresee a circumstance in which at the end of this civil conflict, Iran won't still have a significant presence or influence. So your answer to Senator Lankford's question is a suggestion that the U.S. policy is to take a series of actions to pursue a course that rids Iranian presence or influence in Syria, because that certainly seems to require a heavier lift of American involvement, both on the military and diplomatic side, than this administration is willing to put in.
Yeah. Perhaps I was too definitive. Your factual observation about the fact that there was Iranian influence in Syria before the revolution is absolutely accurate. It would be my guess that there will be Iranian influence there when we all pass. But when I'm thinking of Iran, I'm talking about units and formations and command structure and Quds Force officers freely passing through the country, fomenting and underwriting, importantly, with financial assistance, terror operations and forces in support of the Syrian regime. That's when I say Iran, I'm talking about their military capacity in a way that is very different today than it was, I think, when you were referring to 10, 15 years ago.
That's fair. Lastly, we were all very surprised, our allies were surprised when the president announced his interest in bringing Russia back into the G7 without preconditions. At the very least, he certainly didn't enunciate any conditions upon the invitation that he made getting ready for the G7 conference. Has the position changed? Do we have an invitation open to, or are we willing to allow Russia to rejoin the G7 if they have not fully implemented the Minsk agreement?
I think the president's comments speak for themselves in the sense of, and you saw Ambassador Bolton's announcement of the last hour or so, the president deeply believes that having Russia be part of these important geostrategic conversations is inevitable, and that there's a long history of that. We have about as poor a relationship with Russia as I can recall in my adult lifetime. We have been harder on Russia in this administration than has been the case in many previous administrations. The president is looking forward to an opportunity to find those handful of places where we can have productive conversations that lead to improvements for each of our two countries. I think we're eyes wide open that field space is pretty small. They don't share our values in the same way that the European countries do, but I think the president is hopeful that we can reduce the temperature, reduce the risk for America, and find a handful of places where we can perhaps get a good outcome in Ukraine.
Sounds like the president then is open to allowing them to come back in if the Minsk agreement isn't fulfilled, if he were to get concessions somewhere else.
I couldn't tell you how the president and I will make trade-offs, right? It'll ultimately be his decision. I couldn't tell you which set of trade-offs would ultimately be there. I'm confident that I could identify a set of trade-offs for you where you'd agree that that was the right outcome as well.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.